Okay, so my broad topic given to me today was to talk about something around climate change, drought and regional wellbeing. Not a big topic at all. And what we normally do in my group, and I'm speaking here on behalf of a team of researchers I work with on the Regional Wellbeing Survey, we always start our talks by reminding people that wellbeing is a bit more than just a bit of a fluffy, nice-to-have thing. So how many of you would say, sort of think about, let's get through the day, then let's think about if we can add a bit of wellbeing or fun stuff at the end? And so we tend to think that way when we're dealing with longer term changes as well. We think about, I've got to get through this, then I can worry about my wellbeing later, when I've dealt with this stuff. And it's challenging because increasingly we're recognising that wellbeing is an essential. It's not a nice to have thing that comes after. So if we think about it, it's not just that we want well-being. We don't want to just be well because it makes us feel good, although that's a very nice thing. Well-being is a state where we can actually reach our potential, we can cope with stresses, we can work productively, and we can contribute to our communities. And we do need it to be able to adapt to climate change. When we talk about the well-being of farmers, we need to invest in well-being of farmers, not just because it's important in and of itself, which it is, but because farmers who have higher well-being tend to have more productive farms and adapt them better to maintain their economic return. Because they do more innovation and technology adoption. How many people here can tell me when you've made the most innovation or the most change in your lives, has it usually been during a period when things were going pretty well for you? Or when you've been at your worst, has it been harder to adapt and to change? What we often find is that people go through a period of difficulty to when they come back into the good times that they're better able to make the changes they realised during those bad times were needed. So it's really challenging because we need to support that wellbeing to basically improve resilience. And so we've got lots of reasons to promote wellbeing, and when I talk wellbeing I am talking about those hard outcomes as well as the ones that I personally think are really important, which is that I believe life should be about having a good quality of life, and that should be the ultimate objective. Okay. So when we talk about well-being, we need to get away from the idea that well-being is about being happy or about being healthy. It is about both those things, but it's more about being able to have meaning and purpose in life and being able to fulfil that. So some people, when we measure well-being, some of our people with highest well-being are the people who you would think would not have it. They're the people who've experienced severe challenges in life, who are struggling with disability, struggling with caring for someone in their family, but they've managed to fulfil the meaning and purpose they want to achieve in their life, and they're feeling satisfied about that. Doesn't mean they're happy all the time, and it's an unrealistic goal to be happy all the time. So we need to be cautious when we talk about well-being, because sometimes it almost acts as a bit of extra pressure. You can feel like, oh God, I'm not feeling happy now, I'm just failing at another thing. And we actually have this issue with the current well-being culture of you must have your wellness all sorted out. What we need for our well-being, we need to have reasonable health that we can manage with. We need to live in a good environment. We need to have reasonable financial well-being. Up to a certain point, money really does matter to your well-being. Above that point, it doesn't do much extra for it. So we need a lot of things. We need to feel a sense of belonging to our communities. We need to have positive social relationships. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about two things that are very relevant to climate change, which is self-efficacy. How many of you have heard that term thrown about, apart from by me in previous presentations? Okay, self-efficacy is the idea that we have better well-being when we have self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is feeling like you can achieve the things you want to in life. So you tend to have the best well-being when you don't feel helpless, is the best way to put it. When we feel helpless, when we're feeling like we can't do anything to change our future, is when our well-being tends to take a very big dive. And so when we're talking about climate change, one of our really big challenges is that often we feel a sense of helplessness. What can I do? How many of you have felt that sense of helplessness? Yeah, a lot. And it's challenging because in our current political environment, we need to keep hammering away at how serious climate change is, but by doing so, we often also, without intending to, reduce people feeling capable or able to take action to do something about it. So that's our challenge in the wellbeing space. And it's a challenge of moving. Sorry, I'll shift. I won't go through these. Farmers have some specific wellbeing challenges, and these presentations will be made available later. Okay, so with climate change, the problem we get as the public narrative is we start with healthy, happy farmers, They're hit by extreme events resulting from climate change. That leads to terrible things on the farm, and we end up with an unhealthy and unhappy farmer. We hear those narratives all the time. They're not untrue necessarily, but they're only a small part of the picture, and they're not very helpful sometimes. They're helpful in trying to get people to understand the seriousness of climate change, but not in helping us adapt to it. The reality is we often start with farmers who are sometimes healthy, sometimes happy, sometimes not. They've experienced a lot of challenges in their lives. They've built resilience already through facing a lot of challenges, and they've got a lot of expertise they can draw on to cope with the changes that are coming. They do experience climate change. They are experiencing a range of things. More weather extremes, we've heard a ton about that. It's hard coping with that, but lots of farmers put in place some really innovative actions to cope and adapt. Some of them work, some of them don't. And in an ideal world, farmers are supported to get through that process so that you don't end up being sort of cast off the farm if one thing doesn't work. You have multiple opportunities to trial different things. You achieve your ongoing long-term well-being in a range of ways. And that's one of the things we're struggling a little bit with in farming at the moment, is recognising that there's many different ways farmers can do the right thing to adapt to climate change. And I'll be blunt and say for some, the best thing they can do is leave farming. For others, the best thing they can do is stay in. And we need to make sure that people are able to do all the things that are best for them and best for the land. And we need to make sure the next generation can then learn from what farmers have done as we adapt. Okay. So what I'm talking about there is resilience. And resilience is a process where we're trying to do what Steve talked about. So I won't take you through the tiny eyesight test in the diagram on the right. You're not expected to be able to read it. If anyone can up the back, I'd like to find out what you did for your eyesight. But basically, resilience is the ability to adapt to adversity and to capitalise on opportunities. And when we talk about climate change, yes, we need to talk about systems transformation, like Steve said. To get to being able to transform your farming system, as Steve said, it's really hard. It just feels like too much. And also, you have to be able to cope with the short-term things that are coming at you day to day to be able to get to transformation. So we need to be able to think about long-term transformation. How does the farm need to change in 30 to 40 years' time? How do we gradually get there over the next decades? How do we adapt our current systems over current years to decades to cope with longer droughts, with more intense heat, with higher evaporation so that we can maintain soil moisture better, things like that. And how do we cope when we've got those shorter term things happening like now in a lot of the country where it is really bloody hard to cope? We need to have those coping supports in place as well. So now I'm going to get into talking about some of the research we do. So what our team does is a whole range of projects that look at different aspects of how we can maintain well-being through helping farmers maintain positive outcomes on their farm. And for me, positive outcomes on the farm does not necessarily mean very high profitability, just to be very clear. It means farmers achieving the outcomes they want to achieve on their farm. So this is taken from a project we did with DPI, with the Rural Resilience Program, where we looked at which factors are most important in predicting New South Wales farmers' resilience to climatic variability. The first thing we did in that project was say, well, we need to move away from measuring how exposed farmers have been to drought versus fire versus floods and look at the intersection of all of those things. Because how many of you have the luxury of getting to just cope with one thing at a time on the farm? How many are usually coping with 4 or 5 things going a bit interesting or wrong? That's what we need to understand. So we have a bit of a problem when we focus policy just on one thing at a time without recognising that if you've had the drought, then the fire, then the flood that washes the topsoil away, you're in a very different situation. And the reality is, majority of New South Wales farmers, this is 2015 data, it'll be different now, had experienced at least 2 major climatic challenges since 2010. And a lot of them had experienced 4 or more. So that was in a 5-year period. When we looked at those farmers, and this is where things get exciting for me because I've got graphs, which I'm not going to explain in detail. When we looked at what resilience resources helped people cope with those, what we looked at was farmers who were more and less exposed to different amounts of climatic variability. And with our regional wellbeing survey, we tracked which ones came through that with the best wellbeing. Then we went back to all the things people say matter to your resilience, because people say a lot it matters to your resilience and your well-being. They say you need to have that high self-efficacy, you need to have your social networks, you need to have health, you need to have all kinds of things. And what we found was that 5 things stood out. Farmers who came through and were able to recover faster were the ones who had the high self-efficacy. They felt confident they could make good decisions on the farm to achieve their desired outcomes. They had strong social networks that they were able to maintain. And social networks aren't just about having friends who say provides emotional support. They give concrete ideas about what's going to work. They had institutional resources. Their local communities helped them. And one of the things I'd like to do is give a shout out to all the local businesses, local organisations, local governments that do so much to support farmers during drought. Because in our work, it comes out as absolutely strong. If local businesses are supporting the farmer, they come through better if we have that broader community approach. Health and financial resources actually came in at 4th and 5th. They were less important than those top 3 things in predicting who was doing better. Then we looked at the same thing for farm financial outcomes and found very similar results. But the key thing that stood out was that those farmers who had actually done preparation for drought and risk strategy development, who had then not just done a plan and put it on a shelf, but had actively discussed that plan with other people in their community, had actively monitored how well they were going with their risk preparation and whether their risk strategies worked when something went wrong, and then adapted their planning, were the ones who did much better than others. What was a little frightening is that when we ask farmers if they're doing that type of active planning, around 35% of farmers are doing it. And not all of them are doing it a lot of the time. So we've got a lot we can do there. Okay. Now, a few of you have heard me talk about regenerative farming and wellbeing. Another of the projects our team is looking at is one of those transformational style projects. So we hear a lot of people saying one way to transform your farming system is to adopt regenerative farming. I won't go through all the background on regenerative farming, but we get a lot of claims that moving to a regenerative approach to farming can improve resilience to climatic variability. So we've had Kimberly Brown, a PhD student, looking at that. We've got a range of research coming out, and I'm going to take you very quickly through some of the findings. We've been finding that regenerative farmers do have high well-being, but it depends on how you define regenerative farming. How many of you know farmers who would farm probably pretty regeneratively? They'd look after their soil, their ground cover, they'd look after their soil moisture, they're focused on organic matter, but there's no way in hell they would be called a regenerative farmer. Anyone know someone like that? Some of you may be people like that. And what we found is it doesn't matter if you call yourself a regenerative farmer or not. If farmers were applying regenerative principles, they can call themselves whatever they like, they tend to have better well-being. So that's been an interesting one for us. We found that regenerative farmers are more confident in being able to manage their farm through crises, more confident because they've done a lot of forward planning, more confident they can cope with difficult conditions on the farm, more confident in being optimistic about their farming future. So the next question for us is, well, how is it doing that? Because we don't necessarily want to say everyone become exactly the same type of regenerative farmer. That is not the solution here. What we want is people like Richard who say, I can't do this type of regenerative farming. What can I do to adapt some of the principles I'm seeing there to work for my farm system? So what we've had is Kimberly looking at what's the difference between regenerative farmers and some of the other farmers in our samples. And we survey about 2,000 to 4,000 farmers a year, so we've got some nice big survey samples to work with. And the key things that she's found is that with regenerative farmers, they understand their farming objectives more clearly. So there's a lot of farmers who've never sat back and said, what am I actually doing this for? What are my objectives on the farm? What do I want to achieve out of my farming? Sometimes we have our default objectives. It's what Dad did on the farm. This is what a good farmer should do. This is what the bank says I've got to do. This is a profit margin that says you're a good farmer. Those are not things that help us with setting clear objectives for our farm and making decisions during challenging times. I don't mind what your objectives are, but we need to have clarity about them to then manage our farm to those objectives. And for most regenerative farmers, objectives are really focused on understanding the farm as a system and actively managing it for a range of outcomes, focusing on then maintaining their key ecosystem functions to get there. But the thing we've found really relevant is ongoing observation, learning and adjustment of farm management. So we effectively got the same result as in that DPI project. If you're looking, learning and changing, you tend to do better. Now, because I've got 5 minutes, I'm going to very quickly go through this other project. If you get really excited, I'm looking at you. Okay, if you're interested in this, there is a beautiful long report that could put anyone to sleep on our website, and I will put our website up at the end. But we started looking at, there's been a lot of claims that different NRM practices can improve resilience to drought. And what we looked at was 16 different NRM practices, 23 situations, which ones improve resilience to drought. And we found that lots do. So that's sometimes a helpful answer and sometimes an unhelpful one. Sometimes we get people saying, give me the answer. Other times we get people saying, please don't do what people have done in the past and recommend one practice that is the farming practice to rule them all. And what we found is that people who prioritise maintaining ground cover tend to come through drought better. And that's if there's a range of ways you can do that. Increasing feed reserves for graziers, yes. But again, the planning and the monitoring came out as some of the strongest things that predicted resilience to drought. And resilience to drought here doesn't mean that you go through drought maintaining production. It means you have less of a dip in wellbeing during drought and you can recover your farm faster after a period of rainfall deficiency and before the next one hits. And you've got ways of managing your production levels through different levels of rainfall that work for you. So, what we tend to see is that we've got lots and lots of different strategies. Actually, we'll go back to the previous one. So I can give you lists and lists of different practices different farmers can put in place. One of my challenges is that we quite often get called into government agencies to say, which practice should we ask farmers to do? And our answer is always, please don't do that. What we should be doing is letting farmers actually identify what works best for their situation. So all of these things can be good or bad in different situations. One of the challenges we get is when we see people cutting out some of these options. So, for example, I'll take a controversial one. Sometimes corporatisation of farms can work really well for climate change adaptation. Sometimes it can be terrible. It depends on how that corporatisation occurs. Sometimes remaining in family farming can be good or bad. Again, it depends on how it occurs. What we tend to see the common factors are those clear farm objectives, forward risk planning, monitoring, talking to others and adapting practices, which I've already talked about a fair bit. And the final thought I'll leave you on, what we're tending to see is we're looking at basically seeing that a lot of farmers have a lot of great ideas, but when we talk to farmers about them, they often say, oh, look, I found this works, but yeah, I'm a bit quiet about it down the pub. I don't really feel confident to talk to my neighbours about it, or, people don't think this is quite the right thing to do. Key barriers to successful adaptation to climate change in a lot of farming communities and to maintaining your well-being or feeling confident to do the things you think are right are fear of criticism, ostracism and failure. And we need to build some healthy resilience cultures in farming in Australia where we support well-being by saying it's actually okay to not be perfectly resilient. It's normal and you will have periods where you can't cope, because otherwise we build this unhealthy resilience culture where we expect we're always perfectly able to cope. That is not realistic. That's the first thing we need to do. Then we need to see that failure is critical. We need to be able to fail and then we need to be able to keep adapting until we find things that work. And failure needs to be okay. Because when we see the well-being of farmers dip, it's often because they feel they have failed as a good farmer. And it's a terrible thing to see, especially when often they haven't failed at all. They've learnt a lot through what they've done, but they're seeing themselves as a failure. When we need to adapt and do different things than we've ever done before, we have to get away from that mindset and see failure as a positive when we can. Farming differently to other farmers is okay. That's something we still struggle with in a lot of farming communities across Australia. Another thing we struggle with is that it's okay to leave farming if that is the best thing for you and your land. We've just had one of our team finish his PhD looking at exit from farming. He tracked several hundred farmers who had left farming and found out what had happened to them afterwards, because we never look at that. We talk about leaving farming as though it is the worst possible outcome for a farmer. For some farmers it is, for others it's not. 80% of those farmers said that on balance, with hindsight, it was the best thing they could have done. So we need to make sure that in rural communities, when someone leaves farming, they don't feel like they're going to be ostracised or judged for making that decision. If that is the best decision, they should be supported in doing that, because that actually helps everyone get on with adaptation to climate change. And the final thought, and this is my last point, there is no one climate change adaptation practice, and what we need is 1,000 options for different farmers so that people can pick and choose from lots of ideas, so that they can, rather than being presented with this is exactly how you should adapt, they can say here's 10 ideas of how you can do a different approach to regenerative farming or to non-regenerative farming that might be suitable for your land, your particular production. So we're encouraging that 1,000 ideas idea, and for people to feel able to share those ideas and not feel afraid that they're going to get criticised. I'll leave it there. Thank you.